So basically what they did this year with FRQ is they completely redid the AP exam. And so they did 3 different types, and we went over one of the types last week. We'll do one this week, and then we'll do one in a couple weeks. And so when the College Board released their all their resources this year, they released they have 3 different types of FRQs, and they released practice questions for 2 of the 3 types. And this third type, this design experiment, they didn't release a practice question for. But I went back and I looked at all of the AP FRQs for environmental science that have ever been released, and they actually had 3 design and experiment ones. And so I picked the most recent one, and that's the one that we're going to do tonight. So just like we talked last week, they've got these verbs that they like you to use, or they like to use. And so we're going to kind of talk about these. So in this one, they talk about calculate. We are not going to be calculating in here because this is not the calculation FRQ. There's another FRQ that is the one that has calculations. Describing, they'll probably ask us to do. They may ask us to explain, probably identify. They may ask us to propose a solution, but maybe not. But these might be a little later. Really what they're going to ask us is these big things. Describing, explaining, and identifying. So we'll, as we go through, I'll kind of talk about the difference between describe and identify. So this is that first type that they've mentioned that they're having. And it says design an investigation presents students with an authentic environmental scenario accompanied by either a model or a visual representation or quantitative data. So they may give you some data, or they may just give you like a picture, like a graph or something like that. They'll ask you to describe and explain environmental concepts, processes, and models. They may ask you to analyze that data. They may ask you to analyze research studies that test environmental principles, or they may ask you to describe environmental problems and or potential responses. Okay. So, and like I said, they didn't release any practice examples of this, so this is, this is hoping that this is kind of what they were getting at. So this is a FRQ, I believe it's from 2012. Yeah. And it says the active ingredient in many pesticides are chemical compounds that kill organisms such as insects, mold, and weed. Proponents claim that the use of pesticides improves crop yields and thus protects land and soil by reducing the conversion of forests and wetlands to cropland. Opponents of pesticide use claim that pesticides degrade water and soil quality and that other modern agricultural techniques and practices are responsible for improved crop yields in recent years. Now, obviously, we haven't gotten to crops yet. But like I said, there's only 3 total ever, and this was the most recent one, and I wanted to pick one that was the most recent. So the first thing they're going to do is what they've done in the newer ones is you'll see that they'll have something where they may bold this word. They would bold these words. But I like to go ahead and put a box around them anyway, or underline them, just so I really know to pay attention to that. Okay. And you see they have identify and describe a couple different times, so we'll be able to talk about the difference between the 2. Okay. Now part A has 4 parts, and it's all about designing an experiment. Okay. Part B, again, is talking about your experiment. Describe experimental results that will lead you to reject your hypothesis. And then part C, which has 2 parts, and D, really doesn't have anything to do with your designing an experiment. So let's say you didn't know how to design an experiment, or you didn't really, that's too hard or whatever, you didn't want to mess with that. You should still always attempt the FRQ because you might get some points. But the other thing is use a different color for this section. These 2 have nothing to do with an experiment. So you could answer these two parts without worrying about your experiment. So even if you didn't know how to do the experiment, or you didn't want to do that part, or you didn't have enough time to think about an experiment, you could still do part C and D, okay? Because it just has to do with integrated pest management, which is something we're going to study. And if you're going into the AP exam, you know, and you've studied, you know what integrated pest management is. These part C and D is actually really easy. So, you know, you should always try and see if there's anything you can do in the FRQ, you know, by yourself. Like, even if, you know, if there's anything you can do, if there's a part that you don't know how to do, is there a part that you do know how to do? So I would definitely recommend that for all FRQs. So now let's look at this one. And I'm gonna, okay, so this one says that we need to design a laboratory experiment to determine whether or not a new pesticide, product X, is toxic to minnows, a type of small fish. And for the experiment, we need to do all of the following. So the first thing we need to do is state the hypothesis. And really one of the easiest ways to state a hypothesis is just using an if-then statement. So for example, since we want to know if product X is toxic to minnows, we might say if minnows are exposed to product X, you could even mention like increasing concentrations of product X or something like that. That would even be a better one. Then their mortality will increase, or then survival will be reduced, something like that. Okay, and you can see here, I'm going to use a different color to kind of show you. You know, we did that if-then statement, right? We have if, then. If we do this, then this will happen. Okay, that's basically kind of it's like an easy mode hypothesis, I guess, the easiest way to do a hypothesis. Okay, so then we're going to describe the method we're going to use to test the hypothesis. Okay, and when you do an experimental design, you're going to have a control group. Okay, and you need to have at least 3 groups. Okay, so I'm going to have 3 groups, and I'm not going to write this in the sentence because I'm a really slow computer writer by hand. Okay, so I'm going to have 3 groups. One group, no product X. And 10 minnows. And you can change the amount of minnows. I just kind of made that up. They're not too particular about that. One group is going to have a low concentration of product X and 10 minnows. And then one group will have a high concentration. And I don't know, I don't know what product X is. So I don't know, I don't want to give a specific milligrams per liter, anything like that, because I don't know for product X. So, if I was actually doing this, I would do some background research, and I would research, what might be a high concentration of product X and what might be a low concentration of product X, and I would, use those. But I haven't done any background research. This is a fake product, right? So, I would just kind of be vague like this. The next thing I'm going to say is that all three groups are going to have the same location, temperature. So since we want to keep the water about the same, we don't want to put two groups in a windowsill and one group in the shade, right? We want to have them exactly together. The same amount of light, the same amount of water, and food, and then anything else we can think of. So I'm just going to write ETC, okay? Because you want to make them as close as possible to the same, except for that one thing that you changed, okay? And then we say we're going to monitor it for a suitable amount of time. You know, again, I don't know how long it takes minnows to die to product X, so, you know, that would be something I would discuss in my background research. And then, you know, then I would decide what that time was. And then I might say I would record the number of live minnows daily. Okay, so this is, you know, a general breakdown of how my experiment would be. It's, you know, it's not super detailed, but it at least gives us, you know, an idea of what we're gonna do. Okay, so we're gonna identify the control. Okay, that's what we want to do next. So if I was doing this FRQ, you know, for, you know, on the AP exam, I would write the control is, but I'm just going to circle it here because I don't have a ton of time here, and that, or a space, and then we're going to identify the dependent variable. So the independent variable is the thing that we changed, okay? So the thing that we changed is the amount of product X. Okay, that's what we changed. So I'm going to make this, I'm going to say that's the independent. Okay, and then I'm going to use a different color, and I'll do that. I'll do our dependent variable. So the dependent variable is the thing that changes in response to that independent variable. So what are we doing? We want to see survival, right? So what are we recording? We're recording the number of minnows, right? So that's going to be our dependent variable, is the number of minnows that are alive or the number that die. However, whether you want to be positive or negative about it, I guess. But basically the number of minnows. Okay, so that's kind of how our experiment is kind of lined up, at least. Now we can go to the rubric. This is taking us backwards. Okay, here we go. So this is the rubric for that FRQ, and you can see that their hypothesis must predict a relationship between product X and minnow health. So this is what the AP graders, when they grade this FRQ, this is what they looked at. So they said the hypothesis had to predict a relationship between product X and minnow health, and it had to say a change. So it did we say an increase in product X will result in increased mortality, which is basically decreased survivorship, which is what we said, or does decreasing exposure to product X result in increasing survival? So you can't just say, you know, if I expose them to product X, something will change with the minnows, or, you know, something like that. You have to be a little more specific. And then they did say that you could do an alternative hypothesis. That's allowed too. Okay, now it says the method you would use to test your hypothesis. This is our experiment, right? And you notice they say you must have a minimum of 3 experimental groups and 1 is not exposed to product X. Okay, so, and this is basically the basis of any experimental design experiment. If you want to, if they ask you to write an experimental design or design an experiment in oceanography and apes, whatever class, you want to have at least 3 experimental groups and you want to have at least 1 control, which is, in our case, the one that has no independent variable with it. So since ours was product X, the control is the not exposed to product X. Then the third part, you want to identify your control. So that's the one, what we said, without product X. And then you want to identify the dependent variable. And they say, like, measure of mineral health. So whether the mineral's alive or whether the minerals are dead, something like that is your dependent variable. Okay. So let's go to the next part. So the next part says, describe experimental results that will lead you to reject your hypothesis. So you're rejecting your hypothesis would mean that your whatever you hypothesized did not come true, basically. So we said, if minerals are exposed to product X, then their survival will be reduced. So if we said something like, if lower concentrations, I'm going to use this for concentration, of product X caused more survivability, then we would reject our hypothesis. If higher concentrations cause more survival, if lower concentrations had more deaths, or if higher concentrations had less deaths, then our hypothesis would be rejected. If more things died in the control, then our hypothesis would be rejected. So basically anything where your data reflects, the opposite of your hypothesis. Okay, so but you do, because it says describe experimental results, you have to discuss your data. Now, for a real FRQ, I would not write it like this. I would write it in sentence form. But I'm trying to save space here. So, and then the last part says, one strategy for dealing with agricultural pests is integrated pest management. So let's describe IPM. Okay, so they have describe here and they have identify. Describe means we're going to actually talk about it. We're not just going to say, give an answer and that's it. We're going to describe why. Okay. So it says describe IPM, and as part of your description include 2 specific pest control approaches that are part of IPM. Okay, so basically IPM, this is called integrated pest management, and we'll learn more about this in our agricultural unit. I know this FRQ is not, we haven't gotten to this information yet, so it may feel like, wow, this is really, really hard. When we get to the agricultural unit and you've learned about IPM, this would seem really super easy, like, oh, I know this, But again, I was trying to find an FRQ that best fit this type of FRQ on the new style AP exam. So IPM uses biological, that made a mess. And as always, if you have questions while we're going through this, please, 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 ask them. I would love to answer them. So this is basically the definition of IPM. Okay. Ideally, it reduces the use of pesticides, which is basically like the point of IPM. Like instead of just, just spraying our crops with pesticides and being done with it, which is easy. Instead, maybe we'll use some crop rotation practices and, windbreaks and, things like that to reduce the amount of pests. So some of the examples that we could use to as part of IPM. So I'm not going to, again, if this was an FRQ, I would say like some examples are, but I'm trying to kind of make it a little easier for you guys to see and that kind of thing. You could introduce pest predators. Right, that doesn't use pesticides, but it is a way to reduce pests. Right? Another thing you could do was, like I said, crop rotation. You could do some sort of physical barrier on the crop. So, for example, like a lot of people, they'll use windbreaks to kind of break up the wind on their farms to kind of, which is like basically you'll have like trees, and then you'll have where you're growing your crops, and then you'll have some more trees. And so it doesn't allow the wind to blow as far across your crop. It's broken up by the trees. So then you're not going to have as much erosion and things like that. But also, in addition to that, if you have pests over here, they might not be able to get over here as easily because of the trees. And so, that's a way, like a physical method to control pests that, again, doesn't use pesticides. So there's a whole bunch which we'll learn about when we get to that section, but that's just kind of one of the things that you can do. And then it says, identify an environmental benefit of using IPM. So what is something, what is the benefit to using IPM? And you don't have to describe it because they just say identify. You just need to say an environmental benefit is, bam, okay? So I would, so I could say less pesticide. Now I would put this in a sentence in a real FRQ. I could say, IPM is going to have less pesticide runoff because you're using less pesticide. And you don't even have to do the because part. That's what's so great. You can just say less pesticide runoff. Bam, you've identified it. You don't have to describe. You're done with that one. Okay, you've gotten your point, which is probably what that part is worth. This is probably worth 1 point. If I had to guess, this would be worth 1 point. That would be worth 2. And describing would be worth 2. So you see the part that's not part of your experiment is, 6 of your points. So that's kind of nice. It's over half. And then the last thing it says is describe 2 practices other those that involve pest control that increase crop yields. Okay, so what could we say? We could say, planting high yield crops. Because you get more crop per acre. And again, I would write this in a real sentence. I'm just trying to save space. So planting high yield crops, that would be identify. When I added the because more crops per acre, that's my describe. Okay, so you just have to add that because or why part. The other thing you could say, and it doesn't say to agricultural practices that are environmentally friendly, right? It just says to agricultural practices. So you could say using fertilizers, which, traditionally we don't technically think of that as being necessarily environmentally friendly. Because crop plants get all the nutrients they need. So again, if we were going to kind of, you know, this part would be the ID. The rest of it would be the describe. Okay, so if you stop at what I underlined in yellow, you wouldn't get points for that because you would be identifying instead of describing. By adding that extra part, that's giving you that describe part, those describe points. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between identify and describe. You can see in this part 2, we just said less pesticide runoff, and we left it at that. You could describe if you wanted, but you don't get any points for doing it. Just like in the one just before where we said introduce pest predators, crop rotation, and then describe the windbreaks. They only grade the first 2 things that you choose. So, you know, this windbreak thing that I described, I'm not getting any points for that anyway, so I might as well just not worry about it. Because that's where one place where a lot of students, they kind of, what I consider like wasting time, is if they ask you for one thing that you need, and you say you add like 2 or 3. You're wasting time because they can only grade that first thing. So the second and the third thing, it's like it wasn't even there. Once they see that first thing, they go on, you know, or if they ask you for 2 things and you put 3, that third thing they can't grade, they can't look at it. Even if it's your best, you know, thing, or your best, whatever, you know, your best reason or whatever, they can't look at that third thing. They have to look at the first 2. So another thing that I suggest always is put your very best reasons first and then go from there, because they, you know, again, they're only going to grade the first 2. So if you have a third one that's really awesome, it doesn't matter. It's like it wasn't even there. Another thing I like to mention with FRQs is, let's say you make a mistake while you're writing, and you, you know, since you have to use a pen for the FRQ, let's say that I didn't want this word chemical here. All you have to do is put 1 line through it. They're not supposed to read it if you have just 1 line through it. You don't have to scribble it all the way out or erase it. I had one student that said that he was going to write like a bunch of jokes and silly things and then just cross it off with 1 line. So, you know, the reader could still read it, but they, you know, they wouldn't get graded for it. I don't know if he did that or not, but he always joked that he would